But this was really ridiculous. It was kind of a parody of how the laws should be. And instead, we're getting these people who are, I'm going to roll this back. This is from the Real News Network. And they're talking about this whole charade. And these are the people who don't call themselves corporate Democrats. These are the clowns that say, well, we're actually the progressive wing, and we oppose the Democrat. Can they not see how they've been taken for a ride? How many times can they basically say, well, we're not really the Democratic Party. We actually adhere to a more principled stand on most of these issues. And then they actually take the bait and they support the Democrats on this ridiculous issue just because Kavanaugh happened to be, they could have opposed him the entire time based on his views, just like Ben Swan did, but they didn't.
When thousands of people were occupying the Senate Hart building, and it was a fevered pitch opposing this nomination, and then we.
So this is Mark Steiner from the Real News Network. Let me just reload this.
A Supreme Court Justice of the United States, a permanent lifetime position.
So I'm going to come back to that because, I mean, there's a real leap here between the events of yesterday when thousands of people were occupying the Senate Hart building, and it was a fevered pitch opposing this nomination, and then we see Susan Collins in her speech today, which really was kind of night and day in terms of what we can expect. So I'm going to get to Paul, but I just want to do your reactions to that, since you were in the midst of all that yesterday.
Well, Senator Collins' comments today, her statement on the floor that I listened to this afternoon was very disappointing. If she heard the voices of Americans who were there, who were in the Senate building yesterday, who were at the Supreme Court speaking out, people from all across the country, from Maine, from Alaska, from West Virginia, from Nebraska, from Maryland, talking about why this is so important and why we need to have our senators vote no for this nomination. And that Senator Collins brought up Dr. Ford's testimony, her review of the FBI report, the abbreviated FBI report, and concluded, based on that, not thinking about the process, not addressing the process, which the leadership of the Senate endorsed and advocated for, which is where so much of this problem and this challenge with Judge Kavanaugh's nomination really began. Not to mention that basically this is a job interview, and Judge Kavanaugh clearly showed that this is not the job for him. He doesn't have the temperament. He doesn't have the way to talk to people, to be impartial about decisions that he will make if confirmed. And this is a lifelong appointment. There should have been plenty of time to review the background materials, to have a full FBI report, et cetera, so that we could know whether or not this judge is appropriate for this. Again, this is a lifetime position.
Let's go to the tape here. We want to play what we're calling here SOT 20, which has to do with the issue of due process. Let's watch this together.
But certain fundamental legal principles about due process, the presumption of innocence and fairness, do bear on my thinking, and I cannot abandon them.
She cannot abandon them. Paul J.
Well, this is the underlying argument that all the Republicans are giving. And they're trying to have it two ways. You can't demand due process and presumption of innocence if you don't also demand what a central part of due process, which is called a police investigation. The presumption of innocence comes that the state.
Okay, so what he's saying here is that you can't have due process unless you investigate a crime that's 36 years old, that there's no forensic evidence, there's no video evidence, there's nothing. There's no the testimonials of other witnesses aren't there. You cannot and the account itself by Blasey Ford doesn't give any specifics or particulars. So these are people at the Real News who I've been following for about 3 years who basically believe that in any other situation, they believe that the police and the FBI and any other law enforcement organization is some sort of totalitarian, secret police. And in this case, they're saying, well, how about now, because the allegation has been made, we basically stop the entire world and pry into this person's, personal life for an unknown amount of time. And they think that that's really what due process means. It's not. In order to actually create, to give a good foundation for an investigation, first of all, typically you need things like a warrant in order to do searches, and you need things like probable cause if you don't have a warrant. Where is the probable cause here? And what are you supposed to search? All you have are these witnesses. You don't have a location, you don't have a date, and you don't have anybody who's come forward and said, well, I was there too, and I saw Brett Kavanaugh do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't exist. So these people are employing basically the principles of investigation on a foundation of nothing, when usually they think, well, investigations are a form of harassment. Stop and frisk policy, which they consider blatantly racist, would be fine in this case, because somebody could just say, oh, I've seen this person before, and I've seen him dealing drugs before, so I would like to stop him and frisk him.
State charges you with a crime, and when you hit court, the jury is supposed to presume innocence and make the state make their case. The prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But that means there's a police investigation, not a background check.
Okay, another thing that they're talking about is a police investigation for a crime. But the Democrats were saying over and over and over again that this is not a trial. This is a job interview. And now these people from the Real News are saying, well, it's not a trial, but you have to apply the same standards of a trial in order to actually get due process. Well, do people just go on trial based on somebody's account of something without do people just get arrested based on somebody else saying something? It doesn't work that way. That's where the right to legal representation comes from. The Miranda rights, all of that stuff has the Democrats and these people who are not technically Democrats, they're the far left progressives. They have traditionally said, well, we need to extend defendants' rights. Well, in this case, they're basically throwing defendants' rights in the trash. Anybody who's been accused of a crime is not automatically put on trial for it.
Now, what Dr. Ford accused Kavanaugh of is a crime. Now, it may be under the laws of Maryland in 1982, there's a year-long statute of limitations. Right. So the Montgomery County Police, who issued a statement saying they can't pursue this because of that statute of limitation, it doesn't change the fact in what's, as they say, not a criminal case, but a job interview. Well, in a job interview, you've been alleged to have committed a crime. That's more than, you got a bad reference from somebody. Then, if you believe Dr. Ford, and everyone talks about how persuasive she was, how credible she was, but then you come and pat her on the head and say, oh, as if it's a child speaking, which is how these people often treat women. It's like a child speaking.
Well, if first of all, when she was testifying, she behaved like a child, and her voice was often childlike, and she was behaving like the most that was her pose the entire time, as the vulnerable victim and everything. That was the only thing that made the testimony in any way compelling. If it had been somebody who was much more robust and I want to say less feminine, I guess, nobody would have believed the testimony. It would have been a joke. People would have been like, "What the fuck are you talking about?" So it was somebody. There were many people who said that her testimony, her voice, everything she did was basically childlike. She behaved like a child. She even said at one point that her lawyers didn't appraise her. They didn't communicate to her the option of the Senate Judiciary investigators going to California and speaking to her directly at her home. So she behaved like a child the entire time. She uh, the her entire conduct during this whole thing was of somebody who thinks that the events that happened to the events that happened to her today are out of her control. She behaved. Another thing she said, if you looked at the testimony, was that she didn't report the assault to the FBI because she didn't know how to she didn't know how to contact the FBI. How does somebody not know how to contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation, yet they are able to send an anonymous letter or a letter asking for anonymity to her congresswoman, who then communicates it to Dianne Feinstein? Okay, it's a little harder to find a congressperson than to find the FBI. And also, it happens to be that one of the people that is a known acquaintance of Christine Ford is a former FBI agent. So I would say that's actually evidence of her lying to Congress.
Thinking, oh, yes, she means well, but now we can ignore it. Well, if you believe it's a credible accusation, you don't have to believe there's enough for conviction. As long as you've got enough that a grand jury might say, there's enough here for an indictment, well, then you need to have a criminal investigation. This background check investigation doesn't clear up.
So he just contradicted himself again. He said earlier, maybe like less than 2 minutes ago, that the statute of limitations had expired and etc. So now there is no crime. You can't investigate a crime for which the statute of limitations has expired. And furthermore, the grand jury indictment. Would a grand jury really have indicted Brett Kavanaugh based on the testimony of one accuser, one credible accuser, the other two accusers being kind of not even close to, because those accusations, the Deborah Ramirez and Julie Swetnick ones were made during right after the Ford accusations were made public. So how are you supposed to investigate any of those? How are you supposed to proceed with them? And how can you say that a grand jury would have indicted them? And by the way, the real news has typically in these cases, when it comes to Russiagate, said that there is not enough evidence to proceed with an indictment, that the indictments are jokes. Okay, the Russia indictment, for example, on those trolls probably has almost as much proof, as maybe even more proof than what we have here.
Anything. You can't pursue lines of questioning. You can't subpoena people. You can't have it both ways. Yell about due process and eliminate the investigators.
So one of the things, though, that since you raised these issues, I think it's important to probe this from the three of us. That's what the FBI was supposed to do. The FBI was supposed to do this investigation. There's been all kinds of commentary and people writing op-eds in the Washington Post, pieces in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, many other journals, talking about the people who pleaded with the FBI to be questioned about what happened. People who were his roommates, people who lived in his dormitory, people who drank with him, people who were his friends and colleagues while he was in law school at Yale, and more. And that was completely ignored. You're talking about doing a background investigation. That wasn't even really done.
Yeah, but I think it's very important that the Democratic Party, to a large extent, played along with this game. Why did they accept a week-long extension to a background investigation?
So this is more bullshit from them, where they're trying to say that look, we had all of this stuff where we could throw at him, and the New Yorker said this, and these guys said this, and everything, and is irrelevant. Okay, when you're talking about his college roommate who has been known to have had an adversarial relationship with Kavanaugh back from his time, I think it was at Yale. So he has evidence that Brett Kavanaugh drank a lot. That is not evidence corroborating the actual crime committed, because it doesn't. Look, when you're doing an investigation, there's a reason they talk a lot about things, about the metaphor for casting a net. So why do they call it that? When you put a net out to catch fish, you don't pull up the net and leave it wide and with no and loose. Okay, you pull the net up and tighten it. You get it more narrow in order to trap the fish and possibly the crustaceans that you might be eating, so that you can narrow it down. This does not narrow it down. It actually gives evidence that pretty much widens it. You would say, well, okay, he drank a lot during college, but we already knew that he drank while he was in high school. What does that change? When you're talking about the Sweatnick allegations of the gangbangs and everything, again, different time, different action, different people. Okay, so it doesn't have anything to do with the corroborating the case. So I think we're going to move away from this video. I might go back and watch some of it later, although I don't know why, because they're rehashing the same old crap over and over again. So I'll tell you the next thing that we're going to talk about. So again, I said we were going to talk a little about winners and losers here. So Susan Collins, who is a Republican senator from Maine, has won a lot of brownie points from the public for what she did during and possibly more than she ever has in her entire life. Will that help her get reelected in Maine the next time she's up for reelection? I don't know. Maine is generally a little more liberal of a state. They used to have two Republican senators. I think the other senator was Olympia Snowe, and she was I think voted out in favor of I don't even know if she was voted out. I think she might have just retired. So Olympia Snowe has been replaced by Angus King. And this was only a couple years ago. Oh my, that's not the best photo of her. She actually, this photo is a little better. This is the one yeah, she used to look pretty good. And yeah, I don't care if people object to me commenting on senators' looks, because, screw you. But we don't have to look at people who are basically, they have catcher's mitt face. And by the way, Susan Collins does not. She kind of looks kind of past her prime, if I may say so. So yes, this is about as chauvinist of a broadcast as I'm gonna have, because it's time to finally stop with the bullshit. Okay. So yeah, Snow, I think, retired in 2012, and she was replaced by Angus King, who's up for re-election today. And King happens to be an independent, and he was elected as an independent. And when you get elected or get into office as an independent, I think that it lends to you a lot of credibility. Okay, and he also served at one point as governor of Maine for 8 years. So who else can we talk about becoming an independent? Joe Manchin, who was the Democrat who ended up crossing the lines to support the nominee. Now, earlier I had a question from Arjun, who's from India, as to why Collins's speech was so critical. Well, if not for the fact that Susan Collins had come forward and said, well, I am voting for Justice or Judge Kavanaugh, Manchin would have been the key vote, because it would have been 49 to 49 between the Democrats and the Republicans, and there would have been another senator who was from Montana, who was supposed to go home and see his daughter's wedding, Steve Daines, and you would have had two Republicans. So he would have had to fly back and vote for Kavanaugh. The other on the fence Republican that was talked about, there were two: Jeff Flake, who ended up voting for Kavanaugh, and then of course there was Lisa Murkowski, who ended up saying that she wouldn't vote for him. She ended up voting present, which means that she does not vote either way, meaning her vote kind of goes to waste. So she would have been possibly the vote, enough of a vote if Collins had voted no to torpedo the nomination. Now, with her vote for yes, Manchin could come forward and vote yes as well, without saying, well, he could just cop out and say, well, I wasn't the deciding vote, but I thought I thought that the investigation was enough to convince me. Senator Joe Manchin III, so this is from earlier this year, January 2018. Senator Joe Manchin III of West Virginia told colleagues on Tuesday that he intended to run for re-election this year after all, and ending an anxiety-filled making flirtation with retirement and easing Democratic fears that the most conservative Democrat in the Senate was about to effectively hand his seat to a Republican. So Joe Manchin is typically thought of as kind of a turncoat by the progressives. He was, of course, he was a senator for, he was a senator elected in 2012. This was the year Barack Obama ran for re-election, and Manchin won 60% of the vote in a state where Obama lost by almost the same margin. So Joe Manchin did extremely well for a Democrat in a state that voted against Obama. So he had proven that he could attract the votes of people who were, Republicans. In an interview, Mr. Manchin said he repeatedly expressed his frustration to Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, the Democratic leader, and other colleagues, telling them that this place sucks, before finally signaling Tuesday morning to Mr. Schumer's aide that he would file his re-election paperwork before West Virginia's deadline on Saturday. I was very vocal, Mr. Manchin said, adding, they read between the lines. Even as Democrats won a reprieve, Mr. Manchin's discontent illustrated the divisions in their party between those from states that President Trump easily carried and the more liberal bloc of senators, at least a half dozen of whom are positioning themselves for possible White House runs. The rift contributed to the government shutdown over the weekend and the Monday decision by a group of moderates to force the government's reopening. It also will have to be bridged if Democrats have any hope of regaining the Senate in November, when they must defend 10 seats in states that Mr. Trump won, while winning Republican-held seats in difficult states like Tennessee, Nevada, and Arizona. So at this time of writing, I don't think that they're going to win the one in Tennessee at all. The person who was running in that race on the Democratic side, Phil Bredesen, stated that he would vote against Kavanaugh if he was in that position, and that, I believe, has sunk his candidacy, and his poll numbers will probably continue to drop approaching election day in November. I've said this point blank: if people like me can't win from red states, you'll be in the minority the rest of your life, Mr. Manchin said about his conversations with other Democrats about the need to tolerate more moderate lawmakers. The frustration was all the more striking coming a day after Mr. Manchin celebrated with Republicans and Democrats in the so-called Common Sense Coalition, the bipartisan group that forced the government back open and vowed to lead negotiations over immigration, the budget, and other matters. But even as they celebrated, Mr. Schumer was being harshly attacked for what liberals saw as a capitulation to vulnerable senators like Mr. Manchin, who opposed the shutdown. The pragmatic Mr. Schumer has made no apologies for his efforts to protect Democrats from conservative states, offering Mr. Manchin plum committee assignments in the aftermath of the 2016 election when Mr. Trump was wooing the senator for a cabinet post. Senate Democrats had to hold something of an intervention to persuade Mr. Manchin to run for re-election, recognizing the statement that his abrupt retirement would send about centrism in the political bind it would lead leave Democrats in this November. Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota, another Trump state Democrat, prompted other moderates to lobby Mr. Manchin. Senator Joe Donnelly of Indiana, who is also facing a difficult reelection this fall, left Mr. Manchin a voice message on Monday stating, "We need you," according to a Democrat who heard the message but spoke on the condition of anonymity to protect private communications. Asked Tuesday afternoon about Mr. Manchin's decision to go forward with his reelection campaign, Mr. Donnelly grinned and said, "He's a great senator. I'm really excited he's going to continue." But Senate Democrats appeared nearly stricken earlier in the day when asked about Mr. Manchin, and two of them later said they believed he was unlikely to run as late as Tuesday morning. Blah, blah, blah. A former governor who has remained popular even as the state has drifted from its Democratic roots, Mr. Manchin is most likely the only West Virginia Democrat who could retain the seat. And with the filing deadline days away, it would have been highly unlikely that the party could have put up a competitive candidate. Mr. Manchin indicated he would submit his paperwork on Friday in person at the state capitol in Charleston if the Senate is out of session by then. So then it goes on and on and repeats the same stuff. I will tell you this, okay? The issue with Joe Manchin is, for me, I don't think I would ever support him. I think he's kind of a corporate whore. His daughter is the EpiPen girl who she kind of gouged the prices for that device in order to, and she's I think one of the chief executive or one of the executive officers of Mylan, which is a corporation that produces EpiPens. So I think that Joe Manchin is a piece of crap, but I think he might have come out of this as the smartest man in the U.S. Senate. And that's in terms of strategy, because Joe Manchin, we're talking about Arjun's question here too. Joe Manchin is hated by the progressive left. He's considered basically the turncoat. He's considered the guy who, the corporate Democrat, the classic, just a person. I'll tell you what. The reaction to this will be from the progressive left, the TYT people, and people beyond them, from the Real News Network and places like that. They will ask, if this is what we get from Democratic senators, why even vote for Democrats at all? Why vote for them at all in any of these states? And the issue that they're going to have is that Manchin, I don't like him. I think he's pretty much caught lightning in a bottle here, and I'll explain why. The Democrats, if they don't have Joe Manchin, they don't have anything in West Virginia. They don't have a single other statewide office there. I don't even know how many legislators they have in the state legislature, besides some people in the House of Delegates or whatever. So in this race, you have Joe Manchin. And this was the result from the primary election where he was up against a very progressive candidate, Paula Jean Swearingen, she was, by the way, one of the people from Justice Democrats, which is Cenk Uyghur's organization, or former organization. I think he's not affiliated with them anymore due to his own sexist blog posts. But in any case, Joe Manchin just destroyed her by an almost, it says here, it could have very well been, it's a 70-30 margin, okay? And one could wonder, maybe it would have been more if more people had gone out to vote in the primary. In the Republican primary, there wasn't even close to the amount of votes as in the Democratic one. Okay, Manchin won by far the most votes of anybody. Of course, there was more competition within the Republican primary, and I think you have to believe that there were certainly some people who were saying, well, why do we even need to vote for a Republican candidate when Joe Manchin has a number of positions that do line up with Donald Trump, and some of them they don't. I would say Joe Manchin he's very much a business Democrat. He's very much somebody who says, well, I'm not here in order to do ideological warfare. I'm here to pursue the interests that I have, and I don't know about the interests of West Virginia, but the interests that he has, and that's basically what he's done as a senator for West Virginia, and I think he's done well doing it. It's not something. I don't think it's the type of politics I would endorse. I of course would want somebody a lot more hard and ideological. Somebody like Rand Paul. Somebody like Mike Lee to a certain extent. If you're talking about in the House, there's what's that guy's name? Uh, Justin Amash. So those are things that I think are big differences between Joe Manchin's approach and my approach to who I would vote for. And unfortunately, what's going to happen for the Democrats is, unfortunately, if you're a Democrat, I don't think that Joe Manchin's days in the party are necessarily long. Now, if he gets reelected, which I think at this point, based on what he did this weekend, he helped his reelection effort somewhat, but he's taken a gamble. Because now that he's voted for Kavanaugh, any of the liberal super PACs and other fundraising organizations are going to pull their funding from his race, because people will ask, well, why are we funding this idiot who is basically helping Donald Trump with his main goal of remaking the judiciary? You